Occasionally, we like to look at some of the top young players in the world, and the player we're looking at today is Sina Movahed, and his name was brought up to me in the comments section of one of my videos on Alireza, and it turns out he's 13 years of age and quite an accomplished player. He has one GM norm. In Blitz, he has defeated Alireza Firouzja once, Hikaru Nakamura 3 times. He is currently an FM representing Iran and is a dangerous player and someone you really want to look at in the future that could enter that upper echelon of chess. Today we're going to look at one of his games that he played online Blitz against Hikaru Nakamura. It's a very entertaining game. I hope you enjoy it. Sina Movahed has white, Nakamura has black. Let us jump right in. E4, C6, D4, D5, E5. The Caro-Kann advanced variation, and bishop to f5, getting the bishop outside of the pawn chain before closing it up with e6. And the absolute main line here is knight to f3, but more and more we're seeing top players play this move, h4, which is the move that Sina played. And the idea is to gain space on the king side and even advance with g4, and it prevents black's most natural move here, which is e6, because if black plays e6, white plays g4, and the bishop is very quickly trapped and has nowhere to go. So e6 actually loses. So Nakamura instead plays the move h5. That stops white from gaining any more kingside space, and also now the bishop is not going to be trapped. Sina plays bishop to g5, pinning that e-pawn and continuing to make it hard for Nakamura to play e6. Nakamura plays really the most natural response to that, which is queen to b6, not only stepping out of the pin, but applying pressure to the pawn at b2. FIDE Master Movahed plays bishop to d3, challenging that bishop at f5. The bishop at f5 is very well placed, so he would be happy exchanging that off, which Nakamura does. And now Nakamura plays e6. Now, it's a natural question to ask, what about queen takes b2? That looks like a strong idea, right? He's taking a pawn. The rook at a1 is about to be gone. Well, that doesn't work that great, and let's look why. This move, e6, is the key idea. After queen takes rook, queen to b3, the queen threatens to take on b7, and this pawn at e6 can create some possible mating traps on e7. So if black just plays b5 to defend the pawn in that way, then after knight to f3, white defends the d4 pawn, and now the queen doesn't have anywhere to go. After knight f6 castles, fe6, knight b to d2, we can see the queen is trapped. And if instead of b5, black just takes the pawn at d4, which looks natural, then queen takes b7, queen to e5 check, also helps to defend the knight at b8. But after knight e2, say queen e6, queen takes a8, and he's threatening to win the pin knight at b8. If the queen goes to e5, then bishop to f4, the knight supports the bishop, and the knight at b8 is lost. And if the queen goes to c8, that's actually the same story, since there's a pin on the c file. On the back rank. So taking the pawn at b2 is not a good idea. So Hikaru instead plays e6, knight to d2, and queen to e6. This is a very thematic idea for black in this line of the Caro-Kann to try and trade queens via the a6 square. The reason is he has less space and his king is in the middle of the board, but he has a lot of nice light square control. So if he can get queens off, black is usually doing very well. So c4 is played by Sina, avoiding the exchange of queens, but also gaining space and challenging black's center. Knight to e7, the knight can go to f5. This pawn on d4 can become a bit of a target. Knight g to f3, knight to d7, castles, dc4, and knight c4. White's knight is threatening to jump into d6 with check. There is a pin here, but at the moment, the threat to go into d6 is with check, so black would not be able to take the queen. So Nakamura has to do something about this knight to d6 check threat. Knight to f5 is a good way of covering that square. It covers it twice. And Nakamura plays knight to d5, allowing the bishop to cover the d6 square. Now here, rook f to c1 sets up this idea from white to play the knight at f3 to d2 to e4, so now both knights would be aiming at the d6 square. That d6 square is the big weakness in black's position, and now Sina is ready to jump in to that square. So Nakamura has to challenge that knight on b3, which he does with knight to b6. He can't allow both knights to end up on e4 and c4 and land on d6. b3 defends the knight. Now Nakamura plays bishop to a3, just sort of irritating that rook on c1. The rook moves to e1. Bishop to b4 continues to irritate it, but now bishop to d2. White would love to trade off that dark squared bishop, because then Black would have no defense of the d6 square. If bishop takes d2, the knight can just go right in. After the king f8, queen takes, White has a beautiful position with that knight on d6. So Nakamura avoids that exchange and plays the bishop to e7, but White plays bishop to g5, continuing to pursue that exchange. Here, a decent move might have been knight to c8, so the knight could control d6, but instead Nakamura castles long. And this turns out to be a mistake that Sina is able to take advantage of. First thing he does is gets rid of the bishop defending the d6 square. So now the knight can jump in. The knight takes it, and now knight to d6 check. Hits the king, also threatens knight f7 with a fork. So if the king were to move, you get queens off, and then knight takes f7. You win a pawn and an exchange. That's too much. So Nakamura decides to give up an exchange now to damage White's pawn structure and keep himself from losing the f7 pawn. So rook takes d6, queen takes queen first, wrecking the pawn structure, and now pawn takes rook. So Sina Movahed has created a clear advantage for White. However, when you're playing a super grandmaster, particularly with limited time, it is really hard to actually win the game after you've gotten an advantage. So will he be able to bring home the full point? Let's take a look and see. Knight to f5 attacks the d6 pawn. Rook a to c1 attacks the c6 pawn. The king defends it. The knight comes in. Now the c6 pawn is attacked twice. Knight takes d6, rook takes c6. Not only does he take the c6 pawn, he's threatening the knight at d6, so there's no time to eject the knight at e5 with, say, f6. So he defends the knight with the rook, and now rook's double, and Sina is threatening to penetrate on the 7th rank. So Hikaru plays knight to d5 to control that c7 square so he can't get in. Rook moves, f6, now trying to kick that knight out of e5. The knight goes to c4, offering an exchange of knights, but also potentially moving to a5. He might be able to cause some trouble for Black on a5. And after king to b8, that's exactly what he does. He doesn't trade the knights, but he plays knight to a5. And he's threatening knight to c6 check already, forking the king and the rook. So he's continuing the pressure. He's not getting scared or timid. He's continuing to apply pressure to Nakamura. The rook moves out of the potential fork. a4, this keeps the knight at d6 out of the b5 square. The knight goes to f4, so Hikaru is threatening a fork on e2, hitting the king and the rook. Rook 1 to c2, the rook covers the e2 square. Knight to f5 attacks the d4 pawn. Rook to c7, he says, you can have the pawn, I'd rather attack your king. And if Nakamura were to have taken that pawn, after rook b7, king a8, rook c to c7, he would be mated very, very quickly from this position. So instead of doing that, he plays the knight back to d5, hits the rook at c7, the rook goes to b7 with check, king to a8, which is forced, and now rook to c6. And he's threatening rook takes a6, rook takes a7, checkmate already. Black is in big trouble. So Nakamura is forced to exchange off one of those rooks immediately. He has to do it. Rook to b8, rooks are exchanged, and rook takes e6, knight takes h4. So Sina has preserved his exchange into the endgame, but there's still a lot of complicated play, and knights are really tricky, particularly in shorter time controls. Rook to d6 hits the knight at d5, the knight goes to b6, rook to d8 check, king to c7, and rook to g8. Notice both players, being quite strong, are target conscious. They're always finding those weaknesses and then threatening them. Knight to f5 defends, g7 also attacks d4. Knight to c4 offers an exchange of knights, which Nakamura does not want. He wants to keep both knights on to keep complications. Rook to a8 attacks a7, king to b7, rook to d8, attacking the knight at d5. The knight goes to f4. Now he's potentially threatening to take on d4. If the rook takes, knight to e2 check would fork the king and the rook. But now is the time, Sina says, I'm going to advance my strong passed d-pawn. So he plays d5, sidestepping that tactic and also advancing the pawn. King to c7 hits the rook, rook to a8, king b7, rook to h8, putting some pressure on h5. so that if black takes on d5, he'll be able to take the h5 pawn, and that is what happens. Knight takes d5, rook takes h5, knight d to e7. So it's becoming harder and harder for Nakamura, and these knights defending each other is always an unwieldy sort of structure, because all you have to do is apply pressure to one of the knights, and that undermines the other knight. So we'll see how, if Sina can do that. First he plays g4, doing exactly that, kicking the knight at f5 away. The knight goes to d4, now rook to h7, attacking the g7 pawn. Knight to e6 defends the pawn. And now this strong idea, f4, threatening f5, which would push the knight away from the defense of g7. So black really needs to take that pawn, which he does. But now rook takes g7. It's not just an exchange of one pawn for another. Now this knight at e7 is pinned to the king, and this rook on the 7th rank is very, very strong. Knight f to d5 to defend the knight. Now knight to e3. Like we said, all you have to do is apply pressure to one of those knights to cause the other one to collapse. He cannot take the knight at e3, because then rook takes e7 is with check, and he would actually win the knight and be up an entire rook. So Nakamura steps out of the pin with king to b6, but now knight to d5 check, knight takes d5. And we have a pure endgame, white the exchange up. Rook to f7, attacking the f6 pawn. a5, king to f2, Sina begins to bring his king up. a6, king to f3. If he can kick this knight on d5 away, the f6 pawn will fall, and Nakamura will have no reason to continue playing at that point. King to c5 to defend the knight, king to e4, knight to c3 check, king to f5. But now he brings the knight back to d5, defending f6. But here, Sina Movahed plays a very strong move. Can you see it? That's right, rook takes f6. He goes ahead and gives back the exchange, because if Nakamura takes that rook, after king takes, there's simply nothing to be done. The g-pawn just rushes to the queening square, and the game would be over. He cannot take that rook. So he keeps the knight where it's at, plays the king to b4, at the rook to a6, king takes b3, rook takes a5. In this position, Hikaru Nakamura resigned, because obviously the material imbalance is just too great, and the g-pawn cannot be stopped. Realizing that, he resigned in this position. I hope you enjoyed the game of this very promising young player, already with the GM norm, already with the chess.com rating hovering close to 3,000. And I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.